George Washington was called the Father of America. Statues were built in his honor. His face was carved into mountains. Millions of children learned his name as the greatest leader who ever lived. But here is the secret that haunted him until his dying breath. George Washington owned more than 300 slaves. He built the nation on freedom while keeping human beings in chains. And what's even more tragic, he knew it was wrong. His own letters reveal his guilt, his shame, his desperate attempts to convince himself it was justified. Yet he never freed a single slave during his lifetime. This is not a simple story of a hero. This is the story of a man so broken by his own contradictions that he spent his entire life running from the truth. Today, we ask, how did the man who gave America freedom live as a prisoner to his own sin? How could someone so wise be so blind? And why did he choose power over principle? George Washington was not born into greatness. His father, Augustine Washington, died when George was only 11 years old. Imagine losing your father at that age, losing the person who was supposed to teach you how to be a man. George had no inheritance waiting for him like his older brothers. He had no grand estate. He had no wealth. What he had was hunger. A hunger so deep that it burned inside him every single day. He watched his older brothers receive education in England, expensive tutors, opportunities. George received nothing but the determination to prove he was just as worthy. He taught himself surveying, a skill that required precision, mathematics, and an eye for detail. By the time he was 17, he was working as a surveyor for one of Virginia's wealthiest families. And through that work, he learned something that changed everything. How land could make a man rich and powerful. That obsession with land, with wealth, with status, it would define his entire life. At 23 years old, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis. She was a widow with 2 children and considerable wealth. And here is the first secret. Marriage for Washington was not about love. It was about calculation. Martha brought him property, money, and social standing. He brought her a strong arm and an ambitious mind. Together, they became one of Virginia's most powerful couples. Washington began buying land obsessively, thousands of acres. By 1760, he owned more land than almost any man in Virginia. And with that land came wealth. With wealth came influence. With influence came power. But there was a problem. Land without workers meant nothing. And in colonial Virginia, the only workers a man could truly own were slaves. This is where Washington's ambition and his moral weakness collided. In 1775, the American colonies were in crisis. Britain had imposed taxes without representation. Soldiers were stationed in American cities. The colonists were angry, but they were also afraid. They needed a leader, someone brave enough to challenge the most powerful empire on earth. They chose George Washington, a man of commanding presence, a man of military experience, a man of wealth and status who had everything to lose. And yet, he accepted. This is important. Washington understood the risk. If America lost the war, he would be executed as a traitor. His estates would be seized. His family would be destroyed. But he did it anyway. For 8 years, from 1775 to 1783, Washington led the Continental Army through impossible odds. He fought in frozen winters. His soldiers starved. His army was outnumbered, outgunned, and often outmaneuvered. But Washington never surrendered. He held the army together through sheer will and determination. And slowly, against all probability, the colonists began to win. By 1781, after 8 years of brutal warfare, the British surrendered at Yorktown. America was free. The revolution had succeeded, and Washington's reputation became legendary. Soldiers loved him. Citizens worshipped him. Foreign leaders admired him. He became more than a general. He became a symbol of American liberty itself. Other nations' generals, after winning wars, crowned themselves king. The French offered to make Washington king of America. European powers expected him to seize power. But Washington did something extraordinary. He resigned. He gave up his military position and went home to his plantation. He refused to become a dictator. He put down his sword and returned to his farm. The world had never seen anything like it. A military hero who voluntarily gave up power. It was almost impossible to believe. And this act of sacrifice made him even more beloved. Americans said, "Here is a man we can trust with power because he does not want it." But America needed him. The Articles of Confederation, the first framework for American government, had failed. The nation was falling apart. States were fighting with each other. The economy was collapsing. Foreign powers circled like wolves around wounded prey. In 1789, despite his reluctance, Washington was elected president. He was not excited. He was afraid. He wrote in his diary, "I am conscious that there is no event in the course of the war more trying on my feelings than this." He knew that everything America had fought for depended on him making the right decisions, and in many ways, he did. Washington established the power of the presidency. He showed that a leader could be strong without being a tyrant. He created a cabinet with brilliant but conflicting minds: Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. These men argued with each other constantly, but Washington listened to all of them, made decisions, and moved forward. He established neutrality in foreign wars. He built American credit and respect on the world stage. He created a government that could actually function. But here is the unbearable contradiction. While Washington was building a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal, he was enslaving human beings on his own plantation. His slaves included people like Billy Lee, his personal servant, who fought beside him in the Revolutionary War. Billy Lee had risked his life for American freedom, and yet, after the war, he was still enslaved. Washington's hypocrisy was not accidental. His letters show that he understood it completely. He wrote about slavery being wrong. He worried about God's judgment. He mentioned the contradiction, but he did nothing. Year after year, decade after decade, Washington owned slaves. He bought more slaves. He sold slaves. He beat slaves who tried to escape. And he did all this while accepting the title Father of Freedom. This is not the story we are taught in school. This is the real story. This is the tragedy. As Washington aged, the weight of his contradictions grew heavier. By his 60s, he was exhausted. His body was failing. His mind was troubled. He suffered from severe dental pain. He had false teeth made from human teeth, possibly from enslaved people. Every time he smiled, he was reminded of his power over others. Every time he spoke, pain shot through his jaw. He was literally living with a painful reminder of the suffering he had caused. Washington kept extensive journals, and if we read them carefully, we see a man who was deeply troubled. He could not escape the knowledge of his own hypocrisy. He wrote about the moral evil of slavery. He acknowledged that slavery violated everything America claimed to believe. Yet he continued. He told himself that freeing his slaves would cause economic chaos. He told himself that freeing his slaves would upset Virginia society. He told himself that he would free them in his will after he died. But even this was a compromise that allowed him to avoid responsibility. Other founding fathers also enslaved people. Thomas Jefferson enslaved over 600 people. James Madison enslaved over 100. But many other Americans, thousands of ordinary citizens, recognized slavery as evil and chose not to participate. Quakers had already founded anti-slavery movements. Northern states were beginning to abolish slavery. It was possible to oppose slavery. It was possible to free enslaved people, but Washington chose not to. And this choice, multiplied across a nation, meant that slavery would continue for another 80 years. It meant that 4 million more people would be born into bondage. It meant that the Civil War would eventually be fought. All of this tragedy was linked, in part, to Washington's failure to do what he knew was right. In December 1799, Washington was 67 years old. He was riding his horse in the rain, checking on his plantation. He caught a severe cold. Within days, he developed acute epiglottitis, a life-threatening infection of the throat. On December 14, 1799, George Washington died. His last words were "'Tis well," as if to say, "It is over, I can finally rest." Thousands of people mourned. The nation he founded grieved. Memorials were erected. Poems were written. He was remembered as a saint. But in his will, there was one final act that revealed the depth of his tortured soul. Washington freed his slaves, not during his lifetime, not when it would have mattered, but after his death, in a document nobody would read until it was too late. His wife Martha was shocked. She had not expected this. She felt betrayed. She eventually freed them too, but not happily. Even in death, Washington could not fully commit to doing what was right. Even his final act of conscience came too late to matter to the people he had enslaved. Of the 300+ people he held in captivity during his life, only about 150 were freed after his death. The others remained enslaved under his wife's control. This is the tragedy of George Washington. He was brilliant enough to understand the contradiction. He was sensitive enough to feel the guilt. He was powerful enough to change things, but he was too weak to act. So what does the life of George Washington teach us? First, it teaches us that greatness and failure can exist in the same person. We do not have to choose between honoring someone's achievements and acknowledging their moral failures. Washington genuinely created a system of government that has lasted over 200 years. He genuinely showed that power could be limited and voluntary. These are real accomplishments. But these accomplishments do not erase his enslaving of human beings. Both things are true. The hero and the villain can be the same person. Second, Washington's life teaches us about the cost of compromise. He compromised his principles for comfort, for wealth, for status, for peace, and that compromise hurt millions of people. Every time we choose comfort over conscience, we set ourselves on Washington's path. Every time we know something is wrong but do nothing, we become like him. The question is, will we be different? Will we have the courage he did not have? Third, Washington's life reminds us that silence is a choice. He never publicly opposed slavery. He never spoke against it in his presidency. He kept his doubts private, and silence allowed slavery to continue. If Washington, the most powerful man in America, had spoken against slavery, history might have changed. But he did not speak, and millions suffered because of his silence. Finally, Washington's legacy teaches us about redemption and its limits. Even at the end of his life, even in his will, Washington could not fully free himself from slavery. He remained trapped by it. This is a tragic reminder that some moral failures cannot be fully redeemed. Sometimes, we must live with the consequences of our choices. Sometimes, apologies come too late. Sometimes, freedom is offered only after death, when it means nothing to those who suffered. George Washington built America, but he also showed America its deepest contradiction. A nation founded on freedom, built on slavery. That contradiction has never fully been resolved. We still live with it. We still struggle with it. And we will continue to struggle until we face it honestly. George Washington, the hero, never found the courage to face it. The question is, will we? If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about history, about heroes, about yourself. Subscribe to Epic History Vault for more stories that challenge what you thought you knew. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. History is not just about celebrating heroes. It is about understanding the truth, the beautiful and the ugly truth. And when we understand the full truth, we understand ourselves better. Thank you for watching.